You know, when you stop to think about it, the jump from Final Fantasy V to Final Fantasy VI was pretty huge. Sure, it's not on the same level that the jump from 2D to 3D would be, but it's not just technical improvements in graphics and music I'm talking about here. The overall tone shifted pretty drastically between the last game and this one, and the story is built around solid theming and strong character writing in a way previous games didn't manage nearly as elegantly. It's a difference you can notice right from booting the game up. Prior Final Fantasy games all started with the classic prelude music and relaxing blue colors, and FF5's opening had adventurous trumpets and vast green fields. Here, though, Final Fantasy VI begins with foreboding red and black clouds, bolts of lightning, and a menacing pipe organ. As you start a new game, you're introduced to a world that's notably more gritty. Right away, we're shown that this world has discovered steam and coal, resulting in a sort of steampunk aesthetic that becomes the crux of the game's setting, a sort of medieval fantasy version of the Second Industrial Revolution, where trains and steam engines coexist alongside castles and dragons. The game's color palette even seems to intentionally lean into this more grounded angle, consisting mainly of earthy greens, browns, and grays when compared to the brighter primary colors of entries past. And to flesh out this world they created, Square was sure to fill it with expressive and lively character sprites. Every character, from your party members to random NPCs, are large and richly animated, capable of showing a variety of emotions within the confines of their top-down tile-based world. In every previous Final Fantasy, characters had separate sprites for on the field and for during battle. The field sprites would be smaller and more limited in animation to both save on console processing strain and cartridge space, and to keep environments simple. Meanwhile, battle sprites would be larger and more detailed, with a vast range of animation to account for all the possible battle actions and situations. For Final Fantasy VI, the larger sprites are used across the board, which results in a more unified and consistent visual presentation, keeps everything the player sees cohesive and believable within the setting, and perhaps most importantly, it gives each character a wide array of movements and expressions with which to react to the story they're a part of. Where Final Fantasy IV and V used the graphical quirks of the Super Nintendo somewhat sparingly, Square was not at all shy about showing off this time. Every instance of world map traversal is presented in Mode 7, with chocobos and airships even having full-fledged behind-the-back 360-degree movement, and the airship can even change altitudes. Final Fantasy IV, and even V to a certain extent, visually felt like they were built on 8-bit bones a lot of the time. I previously described FF4 as an 8-bit game on steroids, which could seem underwhelming when compared to the graphical jumps a lot of other NES franchises made in the leap to SNES. Here, though, we're finally seeing what a true 16-bit Final Fantasy looks like, and it looks incredible. The presentation and user interface all around has been improved as well. A built-in minimap shows up anytime you're on the world map, which is useful to keep yourself oriented in those behind-the-back chocobo and airship portions. In addition to color sliders, the menus also have several different window patterns you can choose from if you like, and you can alter text colors as well. You can change the order of automatic spell sorting to prioritize certain types of magic before others. And Square is finally putting those shoulder buttons to good use. Beyond the usual function of allowing the player to run from battle, they can also be used to switch between single and multiple targets, sharp turns on chocobos and airships, and finally, after 5 games, quickly switch from character to character on menu screens. At last, all's right with the world. With Hironobu Sakaguchi promoted to Executive Vice President of Square in 1991, and thus too busy to remain as lead director of Final Fantasy, Sakaguchi would act as producer on FF6, while directorial duties would be split between FF5 writer Yoshinori Kitase and series game designer Hiroyuki Ito. Ito in particular had been the mind behind the improved job system from FF5, and of course the ATB system introduced in FF4, which had already proven to be the franchise's defining gameplay mechanic. Final Fantasy VI's gameplay systems don't really break new ground for the franchise per se. Instead, the focus this time seemed to be on combining and refining all the elements that had proven most successful in prior outings. Much like FF2 and 4, FF6 sees a rotating cast of party members joining the story as it goes along. But introduced here for the first time is the ability for the player to choose their own party of characters from the available pool whenever they want. Once the player has reached a certain point in the story, roughly a third of the way in, their party makeup is completely up to them. With the exception of a handful of moments where 1 or 2 specific characters will be required to trigger certain story events, the player can use any character at any time, and they aren't even obligated to use a full team of 4. There are 14 total characters, the most of any entry yet, and in fact of any mainline Final Fantasy game period. And each of those 14 party members has a predefined role or specialty much like in FF4. The characters all have at least one individual battle command that pertains to their given role and is specific to them. Locke is a treasure hunter with the ability to steal items from enemies. The mysterious assassin Shadow can throw weapons, magic scrolls, and shuriken, and even his dog, Interceptor, may decide to jump into the fight as a counterattack. Sabin's Blitz allows him to perform various attacks using Street Fighter-style button commands, and his twin brother, Edgar, has access to several powerful tools that serve as convenient ways to take out enemies at no MP cost. Cyan can execute advanced Bushido techniques by concentrating and biding his time, and that's pretty useless. The ATB system, by its very nature, is just really unforgiving to this, because any instance of waiting in a Final Fantasy game means you're just giving the enemies more chances to attack. Sorry, Cyan. Good character, bad party member. With the opportunity for the player to pick and choose whichever characters they want at any given moment, this stands in as FF6's version of the job system. Each character's unique abilities means they represent a different FF5 job. Thief, Monk, Ninja, Blue Mage, Berserker, Beastmaster, Samurai, it's all here. We have new jobs in the form of Edgar's Machinist and Setzer's Gambler, and a few characters even seem to combine 2 or more jobs together. For instance, Mog combines a Dancer with a Geomancer, creating various random effects depending on the terrain. And Gao seems to be some amalgamation of Blue Mage, Beastmaster, and Berserker all at once. And to boot, a few relics, this game's version of accessories, can grant the wearer secondary job effects like sprinting, or replace certain commands with new ones, such as Setzer throwing coins instead of spinning slots, or Realm's sketch ability swapping out for the control command. Which is all the better, really, since sketch was bugged in the US release and could literally destroy your save file. Even the Mimic job returns, complete with 3 empty slots with which to set any ability you want, just like in FF5. In the form of a secret optional party member who blew into town from that game. In fact, 3 of the party members are optional, marking the first time a Final Fantasy title has featured non-mandatory secret party members. And just to make every character truly their own, each one has their own Desperation attack, which they have a small chance of using in place of a standard attack whenever they're at critical health. Precursors to the Limit Breaks or Overdrive attacks seen in later games. But it wasn't enough to just give each character an assigned class and call it a day. There's still an in-depth and dynamic character progression system along the lines of FF5's, and this time that takes the form of Espers and Magicite. Espers are what FF6's summoned monsters are called, and they now play a larger role in the overall story and gameplay than ever before. Magicite are crystals formed from the essence of an Esper's soul, and when equipped to a character, they can be used to call that monster to the party's aid 1 time per battle. But more importantly, equipping Magicite also allows that character to gradually learn various associated spells at a set rate by accumulating magic points gained at the end of battle. And certain Magicite also grants the character additional stat boosts upon level up. One particular Magicite can even be sacrificed and forged into a powerful sword instead. Of the 14 playable party members, only Terra and Celeste will learn spells on their own via standard level ups, so equipping Magicite is essential in building a diverse team. There are 27 Magicite in all. Well, functionally 26, since the Raiden Magicite replaces the Odin one, and while you can only have one of each Magicite and each character can only equip them one at a time, it still allows players to prioritize the spells and stat gains that they see as most important at their own pace, much along the same lines as FF5's job ability points. So here we have gameplay that more or less acts as a mix of both previous games' systems, taking the best aspects and combining them. You get the unique character roles and abilities from FF4, and the party variety and sense of player agency from FF5. And magic in FF6 ends up being pretty damn broken. It eventually starts to supersede the individual character abilities, and at a certain point, as long as you've got 2 or 3 characters that know Ultima, you're basically set. Yeah, that's the thing about RPGs where you can teach any character any skill. Most players will usually just end up creating a bunch of party members that are all the same. But this is really only a problem if you go out of your way to grind, as Ultima is strictly a late-game spell, and learning it takes a long time for even one character, and so you're never really at risk of having a completely homogenized team. The game's systems are in-depth and challenging enough to appease the completionists and min-maxing crowds, but also simple, engaging, and intuitive enough for the average casual player to just defeat each boss, equip each shiny new weapon, and move on. FF6's gameplay finally strikes a near-perfect balance between characters that are defined by the story while remaining completely open to player customizability. I know I said that FF5 was my favorite Final Fantasy game, but removed from my own personal biases, I think FF6 is probably the best one. It's the one that just gets everything right. The characters all have their own unique role to play in the game's story as well. The dev team has stated that a major goal with FF6's story was that there be no one singular main character. Of all the Final Fantasy games out there, I think this is the one that best pulls off the concept of an ensemble cast. Almost every character is not only given their own character arcs, but are given devoted episodes that make them vital to the story in one way or another. It never feels like any particular character is taking the limelight away from the cast as a whole. I mean, I guess maybe Terra is the closest the game has to a single central character. She's who you start the game as, the crux of the story revolves around her, and she has become the game's representative for crossovers and the like. But she also spends a good chunk of the story completely absent. Of the core 11 characters, every single one is given their own chapter of the story in which they are either the focus or the driving force behind the events. And in fact, as it turns out, the game's story was actually split into these chunks during the scripting process. Sakaguchi created the stories for Terra and Locke, as well as the plot's overall premise about the Gestalian Empire. Yoshinori Kitase would write the stories of Celeste and Gao. Shadow and Setzer were created by monster designer Tetsuya Nomura, while twin brothers Edgar and Sabin were penned by background artist Kaori Tanaka. Once all the stories had been individually fleshed out, it was Kitase's job to integrate them all into a single cohesive plot. The only character who doesn't really contribute a whole lot to the overall story, not counting the optional ones of course, is Gao. His own individual story arc is touching, but beyond his introductory chapter where he basically just serves as a plot device, he kinda just sinks into the background of every major event. I have nothing against the character, don't get me wrong, I like the kid, I just can't say he really, does anything. Shadow in particular stands out in that his story is easily missed. The bulk of his backstory is only accessible through dream sequences, which are randomly triggered whenever the player rests at an inn with Shadow among their party. The game doesn't tell you about these, you discover them completely by chance, and in fact, it isn't even clear what exactly they are at first. So just imagine being 9 years old, playing this game alone in your room late one night, and you bring your party to an inn only to have this pop up with no warning. Kid me would have been creeped the fuck out. FF6 contains a boatload of content, more than one may expect of a game of its vintage. When you're not fighting enemies and leveling up, you can place bids at the Jidoor auction house to obtain new magicite and rare relics. The entire town of Zozo acts as a dungeon of its own, complete with random encounters and a boss fight. The Colosseum allows you to wager items for better ones, as long as your randomly controlled party member can manage to win it from their opponent. Ultima Weapon appears as both an obtainable weapon and a boss fight. There's a cursed shield you can get that harms its wearer when equipped, but winning enough battles while using it will lift the curse and turn it into the best shield in the game. Late in the game, allowing yourself to be swallowed by a certain random enemy will reveal an entire dungeon within it. The Phoenix Cave and the final dungeon both require multiple teams to cooperate in order to get through. And then there's... oh god, the Veldt. The Veldt is by far the part of FF6 that I dread on every single playthrough. The Veldt is where you learn new abilities called Rages for the character Gao, a wild child raised by beasts his whole life. It consists entirely of enemies you've encountered previously, meaning its available cache of monsters grows larger throughout the game, and you have to make several trips to it if you want Gao to be a decent party member. When you encounter a monster you want to learn the rage of, you send Gao off to spend some time with them, and then continue traveling the Veldt until Gao randomly appears at the end of another battle. You gain no EXP while on the Veldt, and while enemies do kinda sorta appear in a set order, it's all random. And there's just so much that can go wrong here, like you can't get the specific enemy you want to show up, or Gao doesn't return to your party in time to learn a new rage, so on and so forth. Gao only learns the rages of enemies you had encountered when he left and when he returned, not any of the ones you encounter in between. And, of course, finding enemies on the Veldt requires you to have fought that enemy elsewhere in the first place, so it's something that permeates through the whole game because you also have to make sure you don't miss any important monsters before they're gone forever. The Veldt isn't just a matter of it sucks if you're a completionist or it sucks if you're trying to get everything. Gao's utility as a character is entirely dependent on how many and what type of rages he's learned, since he lacks a standard attack command completely. Spending time on the Veldt is vital to him, and so ignoring the Veldt makes him borderline useless. And unless you have access to save states, hacks, or just plain cheating, there is no way to manipulate which enemies you encounter on the Veldt. Never in any of my playthroughs has a trip to the Veldt lasted less than 3 hours minimum, no matter how many or how few rages I actually needed. It's terrible, time-consuming, and worst of all, soul-crushingly boring. The overall plot of Final Fantasy VI revolves around an evil empire and an ancient magical war, but the basic A to B plot progression is really not where the story of this game shines. It's serviceable, it's great even, it does its job, there's nothing wrong with the story, and it's also the first time since FF2 that the story doesn't involve the elemental crystals, so it's also a nice change of pace on top of all that. But the best parts of FF6's story are the ones that focus on those character moments that the dev team put so much time and effort into. One memorable moment early on involves the characters being split up into 3 groups, with the order of scenarios being up to the player to decide. The plot can also be pretty clearly split into 3 acts, each one beginning with one character being awoken after some catastrophe. But sprinkled throughout are little character moments, interactions, and flashbacks that serve to flesh out the characters as well as the world they inhabit. A real highlight are the villains, of which you could say there are 3. The raunchy octopus Ultros is one, although he's clearly a comic relief side villain not meant to be taken as a real threat, much in the vein of the previous game's Gilgamesh. Emperor Gestal is the most obvious villain for much of the game's first 2 acts, being the face of the Empire that's on the brink of waging war with all Espers in order to acquire immense magic power just for the sake of it. But the third of the game's recurring villains is Kefka, and he's the one of special note here. For much of those first 2 acts, Kefka is kinda presented as being the incompetent sidekick to Emperor Gestal. He's cruel, yes, but he's also shown to be cowardly and clearly off his rocker. In fact, he seems to be presented as the game's Gilgamesh at first glance. But then in a brilliant end-of-second act twist, Kefka murders the Emperor in cold blood and intentionally disrupts the balance of the world's magic, throwing everything into chaos. The goofy, bumbling sidekick villain is now the story's bona fide big bad. And why did Kefka do this? What does he have to gain? What could his plan be? He doesn't have one. He's just insane. And I love that. Kefka might just be the most despicable, unashamedly evil villain in Final Fantasy history, while simultaneously also being one of the most entertaining. So many Final Fantasy games, heck, so many JRPGs in general, have a habit of giving their villains deep, complicated backstories with layered and nuanced motivations almost out of obligation. And in all fairness, there's nothing wrong with having a complex villain. But a lot of these RPGs fall back on these same fantasy or comic booky tropes for their big bads. Ancient demons out for revenge, aliens looking to conquer, seemingly unstoppable forces of nature, or even just a fellow human who's acting on misguided intentions. Kefka is none of those things. We learn almost nothing about this man. There's one line of dialogue from an NPC that suggests he probably went insane from Magitech experiments, but that's it. And that's perfect. You don't need any more than that. It's honestly a really nice change of pace to have a main antagonist who is, at his core, just a really shitty human being. He's not acting on some grand scheme. He doesn't care. There's no chance of talking things out with him. There's no chance of him being redeemed. He doesn't deserve redemption. This is a guy who commits blatant war crimes and feels no shame about it. At surface level, he's just cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, but even the most in-depth analysis of his character basically just boils down to nihilism. The belief that nothing really matters, and so nothing has value. And that acts as the perfect contrast to everything our main characters end up standing for at the end of the day. Because at its core, the themes of Final Fantasy VI's story are about finding meaning in life, whatever that may mean to you, and about never losing hope, even in the face of hopelessness. Loss and grief also seem to be recurring themes in FF6. Almost every party member has experienced the loss of a loved one in their past, or in a few cases even during the events of the game. Locke failed to save his girlfriend and feels intense guilt for putting her in danger in the first place. Edgar and Sabin lost their father, and the aftermath resulted in the 2 parting ways for years. Setzer and Shadow both lost their best friends, maybe even lovers. And probably most gutting of all, we see Cyan's wife and child murdered in front of him, and eventually he watches them depart on the literal train to the afterlife. Even we, the audience, end up feeling a form of loss, because remember how I said Kefka killed the Emperor and ruined the world for absolutely no reason? Well, our heroes also completely fail to stop him. There's no gray area in that, no silver lining. They don't somehow manage to undo it all just before it all goes bad in some climactic final scene. The party loses. Kefka wins. The world fell to ruin, many of its people now dead, and sitting atop the literal remnants of his destruction sits the Mad Clown, now possessing the power of gods, raining judgment on the helpless people that remain. All for nothing but his own amusement. Celeste wakes from a one-year coma, on an isolated island amid a scorched earth. All seems lost, with even the monsters you fight on the island literally wasting away. Celeste is alone with only Sid to accompany her, the man who practically raised her as a child, and even he is on the brink of death. And when he passes, Celeste gives in to despair. Climbing to the top of a nearby peak, she throws herself off. But her attempt at her own life fails, and she instead drifts back onto the island's shores, waking to the sight of a bird wearing a familiar bandana. This she sees as a sign. Her friends are still alive somewhere. All she needs is the determination to find them. There is still hope yet. It's a powerful scene, and I'll point out that it is entirely possible to save Sid from dying here, but it is notably difficult to pull off. It's set to an invisible countdown timer, and whether you find enough resources to save him in time is left almost entirely up to chance. There's no tangible in-game reward for saving him either, other than the satisfaction of doing so. It's pretty clear that seeing Celeste reach her lowest emotional point is the developer's intent here, and indeed that scene ties so much more deeply into the story's central themes when compared to the alternative. This leads to the third act of the game taking place in this so-called World of Ruin, with Celeste tracking down and reuniting all of the party members, all of whom have been struggling to find new purpose in this destroyed world, and rallying them to rise up against Kefka once and for all. We get a few more of those character-centric moments, with many of the individual arcs reaching their conclusions here as the party members find closure with their pasts and discover what gives them hope and the strength to carry on. Outside of the context of the story, the World of Ruin serves as something of an open-world sandbox. Whereas your order of objectives in the World of Balance was pretty much set in stone, the World of Ruin allows you to tackle quests in any order you desire once you acquire the airship. In fact, you can go straight to Kefka's tower at that point, although you aren't likely to get very far, since the tower requires you to split into 3 teams, and that math does not work out in your favor without a crapload of grinding. There's even an invisible superboss wandering the skies that you may encounter at any moment on the airship. Honestly, the World of Ruin portion of the game feels like what Secret of Mana's third act was trying to do. There, it was just a set order of barely related fetch quests dictated by some jackass NPC, but here everything is almost entirely up to the player's discretion, and for a game of this era, that's actually a pretty big deal. If you plan ahead, it even affects how you play the World of Balance, too, as the contents of certain chests often change into higher quality items if you choose to wait until the World of Ruin to open them. You can even inadvertently get Shadow killed if you decide not to wait for him during the collapse of the floating continent. He'll just be gone for the rest of the game. My favorite thing to do once I'm in the World of Ruin is to get Mog back into the party as soon as possible so I can use his Malalu's charm to avoid random encounters, which allows me to grab the treasures in Kefka's tower way earlier than I'm meant to. And have you ever tried using the Master's Scroll with Setzer's fixed dice? It completely breaks the game, but you're not punished for being clever enough to do these things. These are decisions that completely screw with the game's balance, but they're also decisions that the game is completely okay with letting you make. Of course, a side effect of this sort of open structure is that Kefka almost becomes a complete non-presence for this entire portion of the game. He sits at the top of his tower of garbage until you choose to confront him, and while it's said that he's constantly destroying towns at his own whims and people are constantly living in fear as a result, we really only see this happen one time. It is a bit of a bummer that a villain who was such a major factor in the first 2 acts just sort of sits around doing nothing for the last third of the story. Not to mention, the final dungeon is kinda dull visually. Like, I get that that's the point, it's built from the literal wreckage Kefka's caused over the last year, but FF5's climax had a lot of style, with blue crystals and stars in the background. FF6's sure is a lot less interesting. Seriously, I hope you like brown. With how much the World of Ruin contributes to both the story and gameplay of FF6, it's surprising to learn that it wasn't initially planned. The World of Ruin was added when the dev team realized they were ahead of schedule and had enough time and resources to add way more content than they thought they could. Square had hit their stride making Final Fantasy games by this point, and it sounds like FF6's development went very smoothly, and that thankfully translated into a stronger final result as well. But even beyond the big set-piece story beats and dramatic, intimate character moments, there's a lot of little Easter eggs in the game that add to the lore in ways you may not even notice at first. Like, did you notice how Setzer shows up to your party with a bandana equipped, but then as soon as you unequip it, he can't ever wear it again? This isn't some weird bug, it's a joke from the game designers. Locke wears a bandana as well, and after Setzer's introduced, he's so vain that he refuses to wear the same style of clothing as someone else. And have you ever noticed that the memento ring, whose description says it was a gift from Relm's late mother, can for some reason also be equipped by Shadow? The game gives several small hints throughout that Shadow is actually Relm's father, but it's never thrown into your face. And for a JRPG, that's actually really nice. Look, JRPGs aren't exactly a genre known for subtlety, especially not in Square's case. If this game came out today, they would have planned no less than 1.5 spin-off games solely focusing on Shadow and Relm's backstories. But here they're just like, yeah, they're probably related, so what? Lone Wolf, a recurring NPC from FF5, makes a repeat appearance here, and as I alluded to earlier, the party member Gogo is strongly hinted to be the exact same Gogo you fought as an optional boss in FF5, who was sucked into the void upon his defeat. Apparently this is where he ended up. It's funny though, because since America didn't get FF5 at first, fans were constantly trying to figure out Gogo's real identity like it was some major plot point. Like, maybe he was Emperor Gestal in disguise or something, but he's actually just there to be a fun little reference to the last game. Some of those theories got wild, let me tell you. FF6's localization also warrants mention. The game was released in the US as Final Fantasy III, with the script helmed by Square's resident English translator, Ted Woolsey. Woolsey wrote the English-language version of the game under a serious time crunch of just 1 month. He was told by Square higher-ups to do whatever he needed to do to get an English script to fit within the tight text boxes and cartridge space. On top of that, he was also forced to alter certain dialogue and scenes to fit within Nintendo of America's strict content policies of the time. So for instance, the Holy Spell was renamed to Pearl, and Celeste throwing herself off a cliff was reframed into being a leap of faith. Depending on who you ask, Ted Woolsey was either a hack or a genius, and I personally land in that latter camp. His scripts were written to be coherent first and foremost, and this did a lot to legitimize video game translations after decades of sloppy and stilted English plaguing the industry. Woolsey was a master of taking a flat machine-quality translation and infusing it with the charm and personality that would otherwise be lost in a one-to-one conversion, and his FF6 script is one of the best examples of his work. Sure, he got some of the mythological references a bit mixed up, like with Ultros for instance, but let's see how many times it would take you to figure out that the octopus named Oru Tarosu was supposed to be a reference to the Greek dog Orthros. Much like with my FF4 video, I'm not actually playing a retail copy of the game, but rather a fan-made ROM hack called the Ted Woolsey Uncensored Edition, which intentionally kept the majority of Woolsey's localized script and tone, but otherwise restored all the bits that had to be censored, as well as changed enemy and spell names to match the franchise's modern English terminology. Woolsey may have taken a few liberties, but they were almost always for the sake of preserving the Japanese intent. Most obvious is the central female character's name. In Japanese, she was named Tina. This is a name that, in Japanese, sounds very exotic and otherworldly, as that syllable, the T, the TI, is not a common sound in Japanese diction, but to English speakers, Tina is a pretty average name, and so instead, Woolsey would rename her to Terra, the Latin word for Earth, which is a more interesting name for English ears, and also contrasts with the other magic-wielding character in the game, Celeste, whose name derives from the French word for heaven. Not to mention, the name Terra also ties into her music theme, doubling as the World of Balance's overworld theme. Which does bring me to this game's music. Nobuo Uematsu again composed all of the music for Final Fantasy VI, and honestly, this is probably the best work he's ever done. I feel kind of bad saying that about 30-year-old work from a composer who is A, still alive, and B, still actively working in the business, but the soundtrack for FF6, to me, is what I would consider a perfect soundtrack. Usually with video game music, particularly RPGs, which tend to be longer and thus contain a lot of tracks, there are usually one or two, no matter how much I enjoy the rest of them, where I listen and go, what the hell were they thinking here? But not with this game. Every musical piece in FF6 is a winner. Not a single dud in the lot. And this game also has my favorite town theme in the series, and my favorite version of the Chocobo theme. Even the American team seemed to know this game's music was something special, as Final Fantasy VI was one of the first video game soundtracks to receive a retail album release in the States. And when listened to as an album, the Final Fantasy VI soundtrack almost seems structured like an opera, and one of the game's flashback sequences even ends with a closing curtain. Characters have their own dedicated themes and leitmotifs that get repeated throughout to match their current emotional states. The opening theme gets reprised during both the Act 2 twist and the final battle. There's even a literal opera house sequence almost halfway through, and that honestly might be the most memorable scene from the game. It says something about the strength of the game's presentation and music when the subplot story within a story has been known to make people cry. The final boss theme, Dancing Mad, is a 14-minute behemoth of a piece with 4 movements, each representing a different phase of the fight, which the game seamlessly switches between as you move up each stage. It even reuses Kefka's laughing sound effect within the composition. The game's ending theme is a massive 20-minute piece consisting of reprises of each character's themes as they each share little character moments together one last time. And it's such a beautiful note to end on, no pun intended. The soundtrack really enhances the overall experience of the game and elevates it to something truly beautiful. As you see your party members triumph and the world finally restored to peace, the game's central themes ring true. What gives you meaning? Why do you keep going? What does it mean to have hope? Go out there and find that thing that gives you purpose. If you already have one, hold it dear. And even if the world seems to be falling apart around you, even if you've seemingly lost everything, there's always room for hope.